In previous discussions, we were talking about how individuals learn. We talked about the different learning styles that individuals can use as they interact with their environment to acquire the information they need to achieve goals in their life. In this discussion, we will now shift to talk about learning theories. Over the past 150 years, several different learning theories have been developed to help educators conceptualize the process whereby students learn. These theories serve as the framework or backdrop for how the educational process evolves. Now, throughout time, we have seen changes in some of these learning theories as new ideas and beliefs emerge, and educators start reconceptualizing how it is that students interact with the learning environment. In this discussion, we will be looking at some 21st century learning theories and talk about how you, as an emerging counselor educator, can begin taking these theories, pulling from various components of each theory as they resonate with you and speak to what you believe to be essential to learn, and develop your own personal approach or philosophy of what instruction really looks like. In our times talking so far, we've mentioned several times the importance of teaching and teaching style being unique to you in your personality. Being able to capture the nuances of who you are as an individual and bringing that forward into your teaching style. So as we go through these learning theories and you hear some of the items associated with each theory, think about your own experiences as a student, as an instructor, and just an inquisitive mind in the world. How do you learn? What has been successful for you? How may that then relate to some of these theories we'll look at? So before we begin our discussion of learning theories, a simple question to ponder. Who is responsible for learning? Depending on who you ask, you'll probably get a different answer. I have been in many faculty meetings throughout my career where faculty will discuss shortcomings in the classroom. If students would just put in more effort, if students would spend more time reading the material or thinking about assignments, learning would occur, and it would be a much smoother process. I've also seen enough student evaluations to know that these same conversations occur among students as well. If that instructor had been a better instructor, if they were maybe clearer or more accommodating, or used activities in class that were relatable and useful to me, I would have learned more. This back and forth is not new. It has occurred for many, many years, decades, centuries. The give and take between instructor and student is as old as time. And so, as we look at some of these theories, I want you to keep this question in mind. Who is responsible for learning? And what you'll see in some of these theories is a shift from instructor responsibility to student responsibility to some combination of the two. Now we'll be looking at what I'd like to call kind of three groupings of learning theory. Our classic approaches, our revised 2.0, if you will, approaches, and then our kind of postmodern approaches, our 3.0, next-gen learning theories. Before we can start looking at the future, we need to know about the past. It's important to know where we came from because current conceptualizations and ideas about learning build on the past. They build on past theories and pull parts of those that seem to be useful and leave behind those parts that have either become dated or proven incorrect by updated science and research. So our classic approach is pedagogy. Pedagogy is the study of knowledge acquisition. The root of this word, the peda, refers to child. Most of our classic learning theories are based on child learning. School-age children is where the evidence and the information that built these theories came from. The classic pedagogical approach is based on the idea of what needs to be taught. There is a finite list of items that need to be taught. Learning objectives for that course. So think back to your K through 12 schooling days. Your teachers had learning objectives, lesson plans that they needed to get through. For you to move from 3rd grade to 4th grade and from 4th grade to 5th grade, you needed to be able to demonstrate that you met certain learning objectives. The basic fundamental skills needed to be successful as an adult were partitioned out into different grade levels. This partitioning was based on your developing cognitive abilities. The older you get, the more advanced the assignments that you complete, the more applied the material that you learn. So that's the first root fundamental part of classic pedagogy. The second fundamental part is the question of what are the best methods for achieving those goals. So we've outlined what needs to be taught. We've developed learning objectives for that class, that lesson, that course, or that grade level, whatever grouping unit you're working with. How then do we ensure that students meet those goals? What are the best teaching techniques and methods to use? Again, these methods vary depending on the age and cognitive ability of the student, and also the content and topic area being covered. For example, skills and techniques that you would need in teaching music and the arts are different than what you would need in language, and different than what you would need in math or the sciences. pedagogy is also based on the idea of evidence-based approaches to learning. In classic pedagogy, there are several science-based theories that are used as guiding frameworks for educators in how they interact with their students. So here I show you an example of the learning cycle. The learning cycle is a good visual representation of what's going on in the learning environment from a pedagogical perspective. If we start at the top, there's introduction. As an instructor, it's your responsibility to introduce learning to your students. Instructors serve as an expert role. They are the guides and facilitators of learning. The material that is going to be learned in a course and the way that it will be taught is predetermined by the instructor. That instructor then prepares the learning environment, combining knowledge of the learning objectives that need to be met, the ability levels of your students. You begin to craft out a learning experience that hopefully will successfully achieve learning goals. Now, this could be preparation in terms of your environment. What does the classroom need to look like? What materials will my students need? What resources should be available? As well as preparing students. What type of mindset do they need to get into before beginning a course? What prerequisites or readings should they complete before engaging in an instructional activity? Once that preparation is done, you begin enacting the lesson, working with your students, sharing the information that you have in a way that it will reach your audience. And so again, I ask you to think about your own experience in the K through 12 setting, the types of approaches your first and second grade teachers used was likely, or should I say hopefully, different than what your junior and senior year of high school teachers used. There should be some differentiation of technique based on student need. And then finally, there's some analysis that occurs. Reflecting on the experience, reviewing data collected to see what worked, what might need to be changed in future courses taught. How can you as an instructor best meet your goals and by extension the students' goals as learning objectives in the classroom? And that process is cyclical. That analytical period, that reviewing of the data, reflecting on your experience, shapes how you introduce knowledge next semester. You take information learned and you tweak and you enhance and hopefully improve the delivery of lecture content next semester, thus leading to a more successful learning environment. Now you'll notice at the center of this learning cycle are high leverage practices. You may also hear these referred to as high impact practices. There are a number of instructional techniques that have been identified as high leverage or high impact practices because they have shown to significantly improve student learning. The incorporation of these practices into your classroom instruction enhances your ability to meet your learning objectives and needs for the course. Some examples of high leverage practices are using intensive and explicit instruction, keeping in mind that you as the instructor are the expert. The students are novices. In many cases, this may be their first exposure to the content you're presenting. Therefore, your instruction in discussions, lectures, homeworks, or class projects needs to be very clear and detailed. Do not assume that students have the same understanding of the material that you do. A second practice is using positive feedback, consistently engaging students in the learning process and praising them for efforts made will help students feel more energized about learning and work harder towards achieving their learning objectives. If a student is only making minimal gains towards their learning objectives and they receive no positive affirmations, they may feel that their efforts are not good enough or that they have gone unnoticed. By not receiving positive affirmation, they may discontinue or disengage. Another type of practice that you could use is scaffolding support. Scaffolding, if you think about when you've seen buildings under construction, it's the support beams around the building, on the outside of it, as they're building it. They increase as we go up, level by level. These supports help individuals in their academic pursuits. As students gain the skills, experience, and confidence in their learning, scaffolds can be removed. Those additional supports are no longer needed. Think of training wheels on a bicycle. When you're first learning to ride a bicycle, you may have training wheels attached. They provide additional stability and support as you learn to balance and propel yourself forward through pedaling. Once you start mastering the skills, the training wheels can be removed. Those additional supports are no longer needed. A fourth high leverage practice is active student engagement. Individuals learn by doing. Active experimentation is a vital part of the learning process. Have students be a part of learning. whether it's group activities, in-class exercises or role plays, or take-home assignments, asking them to put into action in their own environments what they learned in class. And then finally, flexible groupings, helping individuals build the skills to work collectively and collaboratively. Working in groups adds additional skills to the learning process. Being able to network with a group of individuals, combine your skills and talents to achieve a goal is an important life skill. Now, these high leverage practices are just a few of those that have been identified in the literature. What's clear, regardless of the approach that you use, these practices help to improve learning. So I mentioned the idea of science-based theories or evidence-based models being a big part of the pedagogical process. Within the framework of pedagogy, there are really three classic learning theories. The first is behaviorism. This does pull from the behavioral approaches you probably learned about early in your counseling training on how we condition learning in individuals. The second theory we'll look at is cognitivism. How we start storing information in our minds, and then once that information is stored, how do we recall and apply that information? And then third, the constructivist approaches. Builds on the idea that knowledge is individual, and we all have a different way of knowing based on what we take in from the world around us and how we synthesize that new information with what we already know. So these are the three basic approaches in classical pedagogy. With the behavioral approach, we're focused on what learners do in response to a stimulus. Behavioralists believe that all learning occurs through interaction with the environment, a sort of cause and effect approach. From this perspective, we then see learners as being very much reactive. They come in with a blank slate. They have these experiences, and the outcomes of those experiences dictate future performance. So in previous discussions, I've given the example of putting your hand on a hot burner on the stove. After doing that, experiencing the pain caused by the intense heat, you likely have learned through reinforcement not to do that again. This approach to learning is at our basic level of learning. It requires repetition. We typically see this a lot in early grade levels. Think back to your first learnings of math or language. A lot of early math is based on repetition. Drilling students on the basic fundamental principles of addition, subtraction, and then moving up to multiplication and division. Perhaps you can remember going through your multiplication tables and start learning. Through repetition, it became a part of who you were. You were able to rattle these off. The responses to 2 times 5, 3 times 5, 4 times 5, 5 times 5, and so on. Within the behavioral approach, the use of reinforcements and punishments is key. And now if you remember from your counseling training, some of the works of Pavlov and Skinner, reinforcements and punishments can be used to shape behavior. A reinforcement is something that we use to induce behavior to occur. We want to increase the likelihood of you doing a prescribed behavior. Punishment is when we want to decrease the occurrences of a behavior. For both reinforcements and punishments, they can be positive or negative. Positive means adding something to the equation. Negative means taking something away from the equation. And so we could end up with 4 different possibilities. We could have a positive reinforcement. Something I add to the equation that increases the likelihood of a student doing a prescribed behavior or action. So I can offer extra credit for students doing additional work. I will give you more points if you do the work. A positive punishment is something that I add that decreases your behavior. So if I have a child at home that is misbehaving, I could ground that student. I could add something to the equation. You are now grounded. You must now stay in your room, not interact with technology, not talk with your friends after school, until this undesirable behavior decreases. So that's a positive punishment. I add something, the grounding, in an attempt to reduce the undesired behavior. We also could have negative reinforcers. Negative now means I'm taking something away from the equation, and I'm doing so because I want to increase your behaviors. If the class does well on this exercise or this activity, there will be no homework tonight. I'm trying to increase their behavior, reinforce it, so I take away something they don't want, their homework. A negative punishment is taking something away from the equation to curb or reduce an unwanted behavior. I can tell a teenager, I'm taking away your phone, or I'm taking away the car keys, until you go a week without getting a discipline referral. So we have these different combinations we could do. In an educational setting, learning theory focuses primarily on positive reinforcements. Things that you could add that reinforce behavior that you would like to see repetitively produced. That's where we go back to our positive feedback, our verbal affirmations, putting stickers on a student's paper for a job well done. All of those are approaches used in the behavioral theory. A second theory is cognitivism. Cognitivism is based on the idea of maximizing the potential of the learner. The key approach here is, how do individuals process and organize new information? If we could key in on how it is that our students learn, we could then structure learning to be most effective. Knowing how individuals process information becomes very helpful. In this approach, students become proactive learners. Within a cognitive perspective, we start incorporating students into a leadership role in their own learning. They become a little bit more self-directed. It's not as we once had in the behavioral approach, where it is all the instructor telling and the students absorbing it like a sponge. In this approach, we're looking at focusing on higher order learning. And so we talked about Kolb's learning model in the past, but other approaches look at this idea of cognition being our ability as individuals to absorb and retain information through our senses. As we grow, our senses become more finely tuned, more receptive to other information, and we now have this pool of information that we can build on. And so that leads to the idea of a cognitive learning loop. And so the cognitive learning loop has three components to it. These three components interact with one another in a way that helps learning occur and crystallize that learning so that it's useful in future situations. The first part of the cognitive learning loop is comprehension. So as information is shared, the individual begins comprehending what that means. Comprehension then interacts with memory. As I'm taking in new information, your brain, as a finely tuned computer, begins cross-referencing that new information with everything that you have learned in the past and retained from the past. It's trying to see if this new information is similar or dissimilar to what you already know. So before creating new learning, the default mechanism in your brain is to look and see if this could be folded in to an already formed cognitive schema that you have. So the example we typically use when talking about cognitive schema, maybe as a small child growing up, you had a pet cat. And so your parents taught you that that animal in your home was a cat. And you started developing this schema about the cat. I have a cat. The cat has 4 legs, a tail, and fur. That is what you define as a cat. Now, if you can remember back that far, think about maybe the first time you interacted with a dog. That first time you saw a dog, your mind goes through this process. Okay, I'm looking at something. I see this object in front of me. It has 4 legs, a tail, and fur. This must be a cat. You fit it in with your existing cognitive schema. Learning occurs when an instructor then shares with you that no, this is not a cat, this is a dog. There are differences between the two. And so as we grow and learn, our schema become more specific. Because there are a lot of animals that have 4 legs, a tail, and fur. And so as we gain more experiences, as our conceptual abilities develop, we're able to start differentiating and having more categories of that type of animal and where it falls. So combining comprehension and memory leads us to application, the ability to apply information in the future. So the first time that you see a bird, you start now applying your learning that you have. And this is how learning grows from the cognitive perspective. And that loop keeps flowing back and forth. The third approach is the constructivist approach. The constructivist approach is based on the idea that there is shared knowledge and authority between student and teacher. As an instructor, you share information with your students, but they also share information with you. So in a way, you both become learners in this process. You also both become authority. So you may have all the training and experience in counseling. You'll have multiple advanced degrees by the time you finish this PhD. You'll have clinical experience, supervisory experiences, instructional experiences once you become a counselor educator. All this knowledge, and we haven't even begun to talk about the research that you'll do and the expertise that you'll develop. So you definitely are an authority. But your students are authorities as well. All that knowledge you have tells you nothing about the background of your student. the experiences that student has had, where they've come from. And they're the only one who has walked in their shoes. They're the expert of their story. And so, in a constructivist approach, we want to promote that type of contribution to the learning process. As an instructor, we serve more as a guide, encouraging students to take an active role in learning, being proactive in what they do. The constructive approach is based on higher order learning. The idea that learning is a social activity. It's something that we all as individuals are motivated to do. Now, before you give me the but, I know what you're thinking. There are some topics that we may not be motivated to learn. And that's true. I'm not saying that we are always motivated to learn every topic at all times. But the general process exists. We want to learn. We want to grow. We want to feel part of a connected social group. And so in this higher order approach within the constructivist theory, people learn to learn. They're not only learning information, they're learning strategies. They're figuring out how they can acquire information to help them achieve a goal. And so this is the premise behind the idea of being lifelong learners. That once we finish school, we don't just wipe our hands clean and say, I've completed all my education, I no longer have to learn anything. There's always more to learn. And so these are the three learning theories commonly associated with the pedagogical approach, which I've identified as kind of our classic approach. Now, based off of these learning theories, we have a way of understanding student development. And so you probably have seen this before, Bloom's taxonomy, which creates sort of a hierarchy or developmental process by which learning occurs. What you may or may not be aware of is that Bloom's approach was actually updated and revised in 2001. A couple of words were changed. The two outer rings, in this case the red and the green ring, switched spaces. But what happened was a group of professionals, psychologists, curriculum specialists, educators, theorists, made a strategic shift in Bloom's taxonomy. The big component here was shifting the focus away from an educational goal, so an outcome, what we shoot for, to more of a dynamic learning process. And so you'll notice that the words are now action verbs. By adding the gerund to the end, we're now looking at skill sets that individuals acquire that they could then use. So it's no longer that each level represents, here's the goal, here's the outcome, the finish line, if you will, that we're trying to get to. It's the process instead. And so if we start at the bottom with remembering and move our way up, you'll see that the cognitive complexity at each level increases. And towards the right, the list of verbs, action words become a little bit more involved, what we ask individuals to do. As the lower order skills are built and integrated into a person's learning style, the more higher order activities can be implemented. So coming up with classroom assignments or activities that focus on evaluating and creating are probably not going to be conducive to success early on in a semester, early in a student's counselor training program, when they haven't even learned the basic information yet. Now, another part of this taxonomy is the differentiation of knowledge. So not only are there different learning processes that develop, these action verbs here, but there is also different types of knowledge that are learned. And so Bloom talks about 4 different types of knowledge. Factual knowledge, which is our base level knowledge, learning about a construct. Again, I'll use the example of early in your education. You learned addition in school in your math courses. And you learned that 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 4, 3 plus 3 is 6, and so on and so forth. You took this information as fact. You memorized all of these responses. And when a teacher asked you a question, that answer popped into your head. The second component is conceptual knowledge. Conceptual knowledge now starts looking at how you use those basic principles you learn and apply them in new situations, in new settings. So you learned how addition works. Now, if I give you a problem that we may not have gone over in school, 4 plus 4, you can use the same principles for that conceptual part. The third type of knowledge is procedural, putting knowledge into action. So let's fast forward. We'll not use our early math examples, but master's level counseling students, our counselor trainees. You'll be supervising master's level counseling students who are now in this procedural knowledge state. They've acquired information in their coursework, and now they're going to start seeing clients. They're now going to be asked to apply the skills they learned in a real life setting. The fourth approach is the metacognitive approach. In the metacognitive knowledge, we're now looking at learning how we learn. Individuals now focus on 2 aspects: learning information, but then also reflecting on the learning process and starting to think, how could I have done that more efficiently? What would have been a better approach? And so learning to learn now provides the blueprint for how additional information will be learned in the future. So this type of differentiation of knowledge, according to a Bloom's taxonomy, can be very helpful as you design a course. We actually use this approach at the program level in working with our CACREP accreditation. When we began preparing for our CACREP reaccreditation a couple of years ago, we came up with this idea of applying this concept here in developing our key performance indicators for the program. In CACREP nomenclature, key performance indicators are signature assignments, benchmark skill sets that we as a program, and all programs, would hold up as being, this is what we identify as the essential elements that students graduating from our program should be able to demonstrate. And so our key performance indicators in each of the different content areas throughout the curriculum feature factual, conceptual, and procedural indicators. We want to be able to show that students coming through our training programs have basic factual information. They then have the ability to take that information, conceptualize it in different ways, synthesize it, and combine it with what they know from other courses, so that all of our core areas are not distinct silos of information that students get. They're able to put it all together and start conceptualizing clients from a holistic perspective. And then procedural, can they apply the information? Taking all of that they've been learning and thinking about, and now using it in their work with clients. Now, these pedagogical approaches, I told you earlier that the root word, the peda, refers to child learning strategies, but they're used throughout. The title of our course is Counselor Education Pedagogy. So these approaches are used for learners of all ages. But one revision that comes up has been this look at adult learners. And so the idea of focused attention on adult learning came forward with the work of Malcolm Knowles. And what Knowles talked about is adults engaged in the learning process may have some fundamentally different ideas about learning than children. Because they have these fundamental differences, perhaps there's a need to augment the learning process. And so from his research, we have these 5 assumptions of adult learners that we'll kind of talk about. The first refers to self-concept. Adult learners have shifted from a dependent personality to a self-directed individual. So if you subscribe to the developmental approaches of Piaget or any of these moral cognitive developmental models, we have this idea that our self-concept, our image of ourselves, evolves over time. And so we go through these stages from childhood through adolescence and early adulthood, where we start to find our place in the world, in who we are. Throughout those processes, we are very much dependent on others for helping us form our self-concept. Did our parents give us enough love and attention? How did teachers play into our self-concept? Were we positively reinforced, going back to the behavioral approaches? Or did we receive negative feedback? And then moving on to our friendships and our close relationships, how those help define who we are. Well, all of that serves as the backdrop of your educational experience in the K through 12 environment. Not only are you learning information about math and science and social studies and history and art, you're also developing as a person and learning about yourself. But for adult learners, for the most part, we've reached a stage where our self-concept is pretty much formalized. We know who we are. We may be completely comfortable with it. There may be parts of it that we're not as fond of, but we have a very good sense of who we are as an individual. And so now we're more self-directed in our interactions with the world. We know who we are, we know what we like, we know the types of people we want to associate with. And so we seek out information and we seek out experiences that correlate with how we view ourselves. The adult learning experience is a shift from teaching to experience. As a small child, the teacher is the expert because the teacher has all the experience. Small children have very little experiences to draw upon in terms of taking in information and relating it to what they know. But as adults, there's a wealth of experience to draw on. That could be life experience, work experience, relational experiences. And so with working with adult learners, that life experience needs to be acknowledged, appreciated, and somehow integrated into the learning process. There's also a shift in the readiness to learn. As a child, your learning is predicated on satisfying academic requirements. Why did you take an algebra class or a calculus class? Well, that was what was required at your school, or that was required by your state educational agency. You learned it because you had to. But adults have a different motivation to learn. They are now at a point where they want to learn information that's going to help them master social roles. And these social roles include vocational as well. Teach me what I need to be successful in my career, in my life, in my relationships. In early academic settings, your orientation to learning was delayed utility. You were learning skills that theoretically, in some cases, reality in others, were skills that you would need when you became an adult and entered the world of work. All right, you probably, as you hear me talk, have flashbacks in your head of teachers at some point in your early schooling saying, maybe not today, but someday this will be important information for you to know. Well, with adult learners, they're not looking at the delayed aspect. They want immediate application. Most of our adult learners are returning to academic settings, either shifting careers or participating in advanced learning while still holding employment. They want application. Help me to see how what you're teaching me today I can directly apply tomorrow or this coming month in my day-to-day work activities. And then finally, the motivation to learn shifts from an extrinsic to an intrinsic perspective. At a young age, you're motivated to learn for extrinsic purposes. You don't want to get bad grades because then your parents may punish you. They may take away privileges that you have. You may not do well in school. You may end up being held back a year. Any sorts of these things are all extrinsic, outside of you, motivators. But for adult learners, the motivation is all internal. There is no state requirement for you to be in school right now as doctoral students. You all chose to come back for this degree. For whatever reasons motivated you to do so. You chose to further your education for one reason or another. And so as we go through this list, you might resonate with a lot of these, that yes, that's true. This is how I'm approaching academics. And in our cohorts, across the cohorts, we see this mixture of students. Some individuals enter programs right from their previous degree, whether it's master's students coming directly from an undergraduate program or doctoral students coming directly from a master's program. We see other individuals who have work experience years in between their degrees. We have some individuals who have families, other individuals who do not. All of this comes together and shapes who you are as learners. And it makes for a very eclectic approach in a classroom because there's a lot less homogeneity than you would have in an early grades experience. So if you were a second grade teacher, you're going to be dealing with all 7-year-olds. For the most part, are all from the same geographic region and are likely all at the same developmental stage. But as a counselor educator, working in graduate programs, whether you're teaching masters or doctoral students, you're going to have individuals that are all over the spectrum. And so learning these principles of adult learning are helpful in your educational pursuits. And so we look at adult learning, which is defined as andragogy, as being education 2.0, kind of the revised approach. And again, we see some principles of adult learning. Involve your adult learners in the process. They should be involved in the planning and evaluation of their instruction. Value the experiences that adult learners bring to the classroom. The experiences they've had in life, good and bad, can provide the basis for their learning activities. Perhaps you work out case studies or examples or role plays, group activities in which they have to pull from their professional experiences. Keep the focus on making content relevant and impactful to learners. I've shared with you my approach is to include activities and courses that are directly relevant to your professional practice. They're activities that you'll be able to use later on in your counselor educator careers. And then finally, learning should be problem-centered. Content is important, but at a graduate level, working with adult students, you have a lot of the content. You may or may not know it. You may or may not recall and use it frequently, but a lot of the content you have is in you. What learning is about is helping you find ways to bring it out and recall it when you need it. And so the focus on problem-centered learning is helping individuals approach a problem with an inquisitive and open mind, utilize their catalog of skills, abilities, and knowledge to find the best solution for the given problem, and execute a plan of action. If that sounds familiar to you, it's also the fundamental premise of what we do as counselors in our work with clients. We don't tell clients what to do in situations. We probably don't even know what to do in all situations. But what we do is we help the clients learn a process of taking information, viewing it from the perspective of who they are as an individual, what skills and abilities they have, and how they can tackle that problem. So andragogy looks at our education 2.0. What we see a lot of educational models using now, particularly at the collegiate level, undergraduate and graduate, is a combination of approaches. Pedagogy combined with andragogy. And so here we see a chart that looks at the different combinations of pedagogical and andragogical approaches and its dependence on two factors: student maturity and teacher involvement. And so we could create learning environments that are starting in the lower right-hand corner, high pedagogy, low andragogy, moving up, high pedagogy and high andragogy, to the left, low pedagogy and high andragogy, and then dropping down, low pedagogy and low andragogy. So what do those mean? At stage 1, where we had high pedagogy and low andragogy, we see students who are very dependent. They come into the learning environment wanting you to tell them what to do, what they should be learning, and how they should be learning. So your role as a teacher is very much authoritative. You are seen as the expert. In stage 2, which was the high pedagogy, high andragogy, you have students that are very much interested in learning. They have an excitement about gaining new knowledge and improving their skill set. As an educator, you then serve as a motivator. You want to stoke those flames of interest and keep students engaged in the process. In stage 3, which is low pedagogy and high andragogy, We have students that are very much wanting to be involved in the learning process. These are, as I mentioned earlier, situations where students are sharing with you as much as you're sharing with them. They would much prefer actively participating in a class rather than passively listening to a lecture. And so as an instructor, you become a facilitator. And then finally, we look at a fourth stage where we have low pedagogy combined with low andragogy. And we have self-directed learning. Individuals now become an expert on their own learning and what they need to do. This could be based on their experiences, their known needs at a time in terms of career advancement. And so teachers become consultants. They are referenced when additional information is needed to fill in the gaps between what students already know. This combined approach is what a lot of counselor educators use in developing their courses. We typically start early in semesters with our courses at a stage 2 and hopefully move up to a stage 3. By the end of your program, in a doctoral program, for example, when you start shifting into your dissertation stage, you'll find that you're at a stage 4. You become more self-directed. You've chosen a dissertation topic that resonates with you and speaks to your interests clinically and research-wise. And that faculty, particularly your dissertation chair, becomes more of a consultant who helps and guides you through the process. So now we move on to the next gen, or postmodern approach. And I call it Education 3.0. This approach is called heutagogy. Heutagogy is based on this idea of knowledge sharing. And so there's a combination of teacher-led and self-directed learning. Here is where I see the future of counselor education going. Some principles of the heutagogical perspective. This idea of self-determined action learning. Students come to the educational learning environment with their own problems and want to learn skills to solve those problems. So rather than talking about case studies that may or may not be relevant to what an individual is experiencing in their own practice settings, novice counselors come in with their own situations, cases they're dealing with that have stumped them, or they felt they were unsure how to prepare for. This perspective utilizes a lot of learning contracts or flexible curriculums. There's a negotiation between students and faculty on how assessment will look. When there is shared ownership and collaboration in the learning process, there's more investment in the learning. Students are contributing what they need to get out of that class, what they think would be the key elements to focus on. And how do they know this? They're basing it on their understanding of their world of work and the career fields in which they hope to enter. They see what individuals are needing to do in their career field, and they try to use the learning environment to gain those experiences. Among our doctoral students, we have them fill out an individual development plan where students talk about some of the goals that they want to be working on during their time in the program. When our doctoral students get to the internship stage, there's flexibility. The student identifies which components of the counselor education core they want to focus on and gain experience in during that internship experience. Students may choose to work in clinical settings, as supervisors, engage in research projects, gain teaching experience, or participate in leadership and advocacy initiatives. What's important to the student, or what they identify as an area they need additional growth, becomes the curriculum for that student. This approach is based on the idea that knowing how to learn is the most important outcome that we have. Students will learn information and forget information. The amount of information I probably have forgotten in my lifetime as a student, from kindergarten all the way through a doctoral program, and then beyond as a lifelong learner, far outnumbers the things that I've remembered. As we go our different career paths, there will be some information that is more applicable to what you do than others. So it's not the content necessarily that's going to be important. And again, think back to those algebra and calculus classes when you probably were frustrated with your homework at night saying, when am I ever going to use this in life? But it's knowing how to learn, developing those metacognitive skills to learn how to learn. So that in the future, when you don't know the answer, do you know how to find an answer? Do you know what resources to go to? Do you have that literacy to be able to identify reliable sources of information applicable to your situation? Our focus is on the process. And so I talked about the cognitive learning loop earlier. In the heutagogical approach, there's a double loop learning. In this approach, individuals learn information, they solve problems, real world applied problems, but the learning doesn't stop there. It's not a finite solution that works for that one problem. Instead, in this double loop learning, the second layer of learning is when individuals begin reflecting on their problem-solving process. They think about, how did I just accomplish that goal? What skills did I use to solve that problem? What information did I gather? And how did I use that information? Now that the outcome has been achieved, they can think back, what would have been a better way? If I had just had this information or gathered these additional skills, I would have been in a better position. So in this approach, individuals are also reflecting on how they can improve the learning process so that next time they're better, faster, and more efficient. And then finally, the learning goes beyond the discipline. So the skills that you learn in this program, for example, will benefit you even if you choose not to pursue a career in counselor education. The idea that education should be giving you skills that are multifaceted and can be applied in a number of different situations and settings is key. And so here's what this cyclical design process looks like. This double loop learning, if you will. So collaboratively working on learning contracts, negotiating what learning is going to look like, then developing the activities that are going to allow you to gain the skills needed to solve the problems you face. And then being able to measure student outcome, but also having students see the possibility of learning how to learn. Taking information, refining it, and using it to build a better mousetrap, if you will, for the future. So those are a quick overview of learning theories from our traditional classic approaches in the pedagogical model. Advancements with Knoll's work of seeing adult learners as having unique needs and challenges separate from childhood learning philosophies, which got us into our andragogy. The more modern perspective of combining the two, the pedagogy with the andragogy. And then now as we look to the future, our next gen approach is the heutagogy approach, which helps us to kind of see this collaborative approach between student and instructor, and allowing students to shape the way information is going to help them in their real world pursuits. Now, all of this information has some utility to you as a beginning counselor educator. As you're going through this program and you're thinking about who you want to be as an educator, it's important for you to start thinking about your teaching philosophy. How do you view yourself as a counselor educator? What do you see yourself doing with your future students? In a few years, when you begin the job search process, one of the artifacts many programs likely will ask you to submit in your application materials is a teaching philosophy. So your teaching philosophy is a brief statement that describes and shapes who you are as an educator. It's going to provide, in this case, hiring committees at universities a snapshot of who you are as an educator and how you may potentially fit in with the learning style and learning system they have at their university. Long term, it also becomes a tool that's helpful for your future students. They gain a better understanding of who you are as an instructor and how you approach the learning process. But a third consumer is going to be yourself. Your teaching philosophy is a document you can continually come back to and refine throughout your career to ensure fidelity, that you are structuring your classes and you are engaging your students in ways that are consistent with your own understanding of what's important in education. So I provide you with some resources that are in our course module on teaching philosophies and what goes in some of your teaching philosophies. There is no one-size-fits-all template that everyone uses. Again, this is a document that should really speak to you and who you are as an individual and what you would like to convey to others about your understanding of your role as a teacher. So again, in the Blackboard module, there is a document that gives you some tips and pointers on what to include in a teaching philosophy. Not every section listed in that resource needs to be included in your own teaching philosophy. You likely are looking at 1 to 2 pages, so I would not go beyond 2 pages in your teaching philosophy statement. So you really need to maximize what you want to share in a minimal amount of real estate in those 2 pages. My advice is to touch on 4 key aspects when writing a teaching philosophy. After reading that statement, I should, as a potential hiring committee, colleague, student, any of these roles, I should have a sense of, first, what are your values? What do you see as important? What's meaningful to you in terms of education? 2, how do you see knowledge acquisition? So we've talked about this earlier in this class, about how we acquire knowledge. What are the different epistemological approaches we could have to understanding the world around us? 3rd, what skills do you have? What are you bringing to this position that would make you a strong educator? And then 4th, touching on the procedural and applied aspects we've talked about in all of these different approaches today, what does this look like in your instructional approach? If someone were to come in and view your course or watch you engage your students, how would they know what your philosophy was? How does your style of learning and style of teaching translate to the activities that you engage in with your students? So as you begin crafting your teaching philosophy for a course assignment and also something you will use later in your career, keep those 4 elements in mind: your values, how you conceptualize knowledge acquisition, the skills you have as an educator, and how your instructional environment will be structured. And if you touch on those in your teaching philosophy statement, you'll end up with a document that's very telling about you and is very useful to those individuals who want to learn a little bit more about who you are and how you may fit in with a counselor education program and faculty.